Hi everybody, my name's Castor, and it's wonderful to meet you all. The first thing you ought to know about me is that by instinct I'm an incredibly lazy person. So whenever I'm faced with a task or a challenge, the first question I ask myself is, how can I get through this while doing as little work as humanly possible? And so when I saw that the first speech assignment was a talk introducing myself to the audience, my thought immediately went to that common casual social introduction. Hey, how are you? My name's Castor. It's never more than 3 sentences, never takes more than 3 seconds to say, and once you've said it, you're done. You're considered to have introduced yourself, and then you can move on. And I was really tempted to just do that for my talk, to talk for the first 3 seconds of a 5-minute talk and just leave it at that to see what would happen. But I didn't, obviously, and that's the second thing you should know about me, which is that I'm not, in fact, a terribly lazy person. I'll always think about doing as little as I possibly can, but I hardly ever go through with it. I'll almost always do more than the absolute minimum required. So I've been talking for 1.5 minutes now, and I've told you precisely 2 things, that I'm lazy and that I'm not lazy. So if you're not listening carefully, it might sound like I've just contradicted myself and not told you anything at all about me. And I don't think that's actually the case. And that brings me to the third thing that I think you should know about me, which is that I believe in the complexity of things. I think for any idea or object you're likely to encounter, there's no one thing you could say that's going to encompass the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Truth isn't singular like that, it's plural. There's always a multiplicity of truths. Lots of things you can say, some of them even contradictory, but they're all true because there's more than one way for things to be true. And I think that makes things really interesting and meaningful. It also makes things really difficult. If you're considering the problem of introduction, how do you decide what's important and relevant when there's so many things you can say that are true and so many ways for them to be true? How do you pick which statements to make and what context to give them and how much context to give them? It's not an easy question, and I don't think there's an easy and obvious answer. If you think there is one, you should totally talk to me after the meeting. I'm curious to know what you think. No, seriously, that's the fourth thing to know about me. Because I like to imagine that things are much more complex than we usually consider them to be, I get really interested in questions that might seem sort of trivial at first, like the question of how do you go about introducing yourself. And I always like to throw these questions out into a conversation to see how people respond or what other perspectives they have to offer. But this isn't a conversation, it's meant to be a speech, and I think sort of pointing out an interesting question and saying, hey, look at that, isn't that interesting? Sort of drifts back into the territory of laziness. So I'm going to try to talk about one thing that I often do when I have a question that is confusing or stymieing me, and that's to turn to etymology. I think history has a lot of things to offer us, and etymology specifically, the study of the history of words and their meanings and how they change over time. My interest in etymology was kindled in high school, and since then it's been with me constantly, day and night. I'm pretty obsessed with this, actually. So if you look at the word introduction, it comes from Latin. There's 2 words to it: intro, meaning within or inside, and ducere, which means to lead. And this is a very traditional sense of leading, like a military commander or a political leader. It's the same root that we get the English word duke from. So the word introduce just means to lead in, to bring into something. The word first shows up in English in about the 1300s, and it has a very literal meaning. It talks about arriving in physical spaces, to be led somewhere. You would talk about a window introducing sunlight into a room, or you would talk about a political delegation being introduced to the royal palace. About 100 years after that, it took on a very abstract and metaphorical meaning. People would talk about a situation or a progression, one event introducing another. So it would be reasonable to say something like, the hostility between the Republican and Democrat Party introduces the fiscal cliff to the political environment. It's not until about 1500, another 100 years later, that people start talking about introductions to subjects or fields of knowledge. You'll see this on any departmental course offering list. Chem 101 is the introduction to chemistry, or it's introductory econ classes and things like that. And then it's not until the 1700s that you start talking about introducing people. It's actually a pretty recent definition for the word. And you can actually sort of see this when you think about replacing the word with the definition of its word roots. It seems perfectly reasonable to say that you're leading people into a room, and it's perfectly reasonable to say that one situation leads into another, or even that Chem 101 leads into the study of chemistry. But if I say I'm leading you into me, that doesn't sound quite right. It's not what an introduction means. And you can see sort of how newer words have drifted further from the initial definition that way when you examine the roots. But the thing that these all have in common is, despite their very different natures, physical locations, situations, subjects, or people, we still thought it was reasonable to use this word introduce to talk about them. And I think what I take away from that is that there's this common thread of sort of a progression or a development or a causation. The idea that an introduction is the beginning of a process, and it's important not for its own sake, but because of what follows after it. And when considered in that light, it almost doesn't matter what you say to introduce yourself to people, so long as there's enough substance there to provide, a basis for the next interaction, a second and a third and a fourth, and so on. And so long as that's there, you don't need to provide something comprehensive or something correct even necessarily, so long as you provide a basis. So I decided not to worry too much and just sort of talk about introductions. So on that note, I'm going to close with, I think, a more reasonable interpretation of the common social interaction. So hello, my name is Castor. It's wonderful to meet you all. And I hope we do get to know each other well enough that the whole business of introduction seems obsolete and trivial.